My name is Cassidy Monroe. I am 31 years old. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I run a remote compliance and operations service for small hospitality businesses. My entire career is built around one simple truth: the numbers always tell the real story, even when the people behind them refuse to. So when my mother threw a going-away party to celebrate kicking me out of her house and invited the entire neighborhood to watch, I did not cry in the driveway. I took a photo. Because I already knew what the numbers said, and I knew she did not, I pulled into that driveway on a Saturday afternoon in late August to pick up the last of my things. The heat was the first thing I felt, thick and bright off the asphalt. The second thing was the sound. Music from a portable speaker near the back fence, low conversation, the particular clink of glass on glass that means a gathering that has already been going on long enough for people to relax into it. The third thing was the banner. White vinyl red letters, stretched between the two oak trees my father had planted the year I was born. It read, "Fly free, Katie Bug. Mama finally gets her house back. My name is not Katie Bug." It has not been Katie Bug since I was 7, but my mother had always understood that nicknames were a form of reduction, and reduction was her preferred method of control. My Aunt Cheryl was standing near the cooler with a paper plate in one hand and the expression of a woman who had been told a version of this story that made her feel comfortable being here. She saw me and did a small wave that was caught somewhere between welcome and apology. My cousin Derek did not wave at all. He was already on his second beer and wearing the loose grin of someone who had been told the guest of honor deserved whatever was coming. And my mother, Sandra Monroe, stood at the center of it all in a floral sundress, with her hair freshly done, presiding over the grill with a pair of tongs and the satisfied composure of a woman who had spent weeks planning this exact moment. She turned when she heard my car door close. She smiled at me the way she smiled at people she had already defeated. Then she called out to the backyard in a voice large enough for everyone to hear that her daughter had finally come to collect her things. And wasn't it just like her to show up right when the burgers were ready? A few people laughed. Somebody said at least she had good timing. My Uncle Hank, who had been drunk by noon at every family event for the last 15 years, raised his bottle in my direction and said something about how Sandra had put up with enough. I walked past all of them and into the house. The screen door clapped shut behind me, and the party sounds went muffled through the walls. The kitchen still smelled like the vanilla candles I had ordered online months ago because my mother had mentioned she liked them and I had wanted, as I always had wanted, to do one small thing that made coming home feel like belonging somewhere. The candles were still on the counter. She had not moved them. She just no longer mentioned that I had bought them. My last of boxes were in the hallway near the laundry room. Someone had stacked them neatly, which told me my mother had touched them, arranged them, made this part of the performance too. On top of the first box was a handwritten note on a yellow sticky pad. It said, "I raised you the best I could. The rest is yours now." There was a smiley face at the bottom. A smiley face. I picked up the boxes, one under each arm, and walked back through the kitchen, past the counter with the vanilla candles, out through the screen door, and into the backyard, where the full gathering had oriented itself back toward me the way crowds do when they sense the climax approaching. My mother tracked me from the grill. My Uncle Hank started saying something about freeloaders and fresh starts. My cousin Derek laughed at a punchline I did not catch. I set both boxes in my trunk. Then I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, turned around, and took one photo. The banner between the oak trees. My mother by the grill with her tongs. The guests in their lawn chairs. The cooler. The speaker. The whole stage production of a woman celebrating her own kindness at her daughter's expense. My mother frowned when she saw the phone. She called over the noise and asked what I was doing. I looked at her for a long moment and said 2 words that confused her completely: keeping records. Then I got into my car and drove away. In my rearview mirror, the banner caught the afternoon light between the oak trees my father had planted. They were still standing. They would outlast all of this. What my mother did not know, and what I need to tell you now before the rest of the story makes its full weight clear, is that I had spent the previous 6 weeks building a document so thorough and so specific that no amount of charm or reframing or tearful phone calls would ever be able to touch it. I want to go back to the beginning, because a banner between 2 oak trees does not appear without years of groundwork. Sandra Monroe is 56 years old. She has lived in the same house in Knoxville for 23 years, in the neighborhood where she knows every name and every rumor, and exactly which version of events will make her look the most sympathetic. She runs a small event floristry business called Magnolia and Monroe out of a studio space attached to the house. It does weddings, showers, corporate luncheons, and the occasional funeral arrangement for people who want something more personal than a grocery store bouquet. The business has a real website, real clients, and a real reputation built on my mother's genuine talent for making flowers look like they belong somewhere important. It also has a back end that has been quietly falling apart for years, held together not by Sandra Monroe's organizational skills, which are nearly non-existent, but by the years I spent working behind her without ever putting my name on the invoice. I am the only child. My father, Dale Monroe, died when I was 23. A fast illness, the kind that moves through a person in 8 months and leaves the people around them standing in a room that still smells like him with no idea what the next sentence of their life is supposed to be. My father had handled the finances in our house. Not extravagantly, not with any particular sophistication, just steadily. Bills paid on time. A savings account with a real number in it. Insurance that was actually current. The quiet competence of a man who understood that a household was a system, and systems required maintenance. When he died, that maintenance stopped. My mother did not ignore it on purpose. She simply did not know how to do it, and she had never had to learn, and grief made the gap between not knowing and not doing almost invisible. I stepped in because I was there, and because I had inherited my father's instinct for seeing when a system was about to break. At first, it was small things. Reminding her when the business liability insurance was due, setting up automatic payments for the utility accounts after the second late notice in 3 months, talking to the landlord of her studio space when a lease renewal got lost in her inbox and the deadline came and went without a response. Each thing I handled felt like a one-time fix. That is always how it feels at the beginning. Before the one-time fixes accumulate into a job nobody hired, you for and nobody acknowledges, you are doing. I moved back to Knoxville at 27, after a 2-year stint in Nashville working for a hotel group that downsized its compliance team in a way that felt personal, even though I knew it was not. I moved back because my mother said the business was getting complicated and she could use some help thinking through a few things. I thought that meant a few weekends of organizing files and building her a better spreadsheet. What it actually meant was that the business had been operating without a functioning bookkeeping system for over a year. 3 vendor relationships were fraying over late payments. The website's booking inquiry form had stopped forwarding emails to her actual inbox 6 months earlier, and she had no idea. And her business checking account had been overdrawn twice in the previous quarter with fees she had not noticed. I stayed because the problems were solvable and because I am, by training and by temperament, someone who cannot walk past a fixable mess without fixing it. That is both my most useful quality and the one that cost me the most over the years I lived in that house. My professional life during those years looked invisible to my family because it happened on a laptop in a quiet room. I coordinated compliance documentation for 3 small hotel properties in the Southeast, reviewed vendor contracts for a regional catering group, and managed the operational calendar for a boutique wedding venue in Chattanooga. None of that required a commute or a uniform or a boss who could be pointed to as proof that the work was real. To my mother, to my Uncle Hank, to my cousin Derek, work that happened silently on a screen was not quite work. It was something close to leisure that happened to occasionally produce money. So the version of reality my family told each other was clean and simple. Sandra Monroe had been generous enough to give her daughter a room when Nashville had not worked out. Cassidy had been there for almost 4 years now. She worked on her computer, which was fine, but she had not built a real career, which was a shame. Sandra covered the household, kept the lights on, and managed a real business with real clients, while her daughter figured things out at her own pace. Sandra deserved credit for her patience. That story had almost no relationship to what was actually true. The true story lived in a spreadsheet I had been building since my 29th birthday. When I looked at my bank statements and realized that the gap between what I earned and what I had saved was entirely explained by the money I had been quietly moving into my mother's life, not in dramatic gestures, in small, steady transfers that each felt reasonable in the moment and catastrophic in their accumulation. I had covered the business software subscription when the primary card declined 4 times over 2 years. I had paid the studio utility balance twice when it hit the threshold that triggers a service interruption notice. I had advanced a flower supplier payment when an order needed to go out before the account had cleared, and the repayment had never come. I had covered Derek's car insurance once at my mother's request because he was her nephew and family took care of family. I had paid to have the business website rebuilt after the original developer's contact information turned out to be a disconnected number and the platform it was built on had been discontinued. I had spent 40+ hours rebuilding the vendor contact system from scratch after my mother's laptop died, and she had been keeping everything in a local folder she had never backed up. I had written and rewritten client proposals that my mother had drafted in a tone so blunt it would have ended business relationships if sent unedited. I had managed renewal dates for 3 separate business licenses and 1 state registration she had allowed to lapse without realizing the consequences of lapsing it. I had also covered 3 months of my own household costs from my income, while contributing a flat amount monthly toward shared expenses, which my mother described as her supporting me rather than us splitting a household. I had not invoiced any of it. I had not asked for repayment on most of it. I had operated the way daughters and families like mine are trained to operate, as a resource that replenishes itself and does not require acknowledgement because love is supposed to be its own accounting system. The birthday that changed things was not dramatic. I turned 29, sitting at my desk in the spare room with a takeout container and a set of quarterly statements. I had been trying to understand why my savings rate had slowed when my income had actually increased. The answer took me about 40 minutes to find, and about 2 hours to fully accept. I was not living off my mother. My mother was living off me. And more than that, the business that she spoke about as the foundation of her independence. The thing she had built, the proof of her capability. That business was functional in large part because I had been functioning as its invisible operations layer for 3 years without a contract, a salary, or even consistent acknowledgement. I spent the next 6 weeks building the record. Not out of anger, not with any plan yet for what I would do with it, just because I had spent my entire professional life understanding that the numbers tell the truth, and I needed to know what the truth was. I was conservative in every estimate. Where I could not document a specific amount, I left it out rather than approximate. Where I could document it, I included the date, the amount, the method of transfer, and a 1-line description of what it had covered. The total, when I finally added the last line, was $31,400 in direct financial contributions over 37 months. That did not include the unpaid labor, which I calculated separately at a conservative hourly rate for the category of work involved, and which added another $18,000 in estimated value. It did not include the vendor relationships I had personally preserved through communication. My mother did not know I had managed. It did not include the booking inquiry form I had discovered and fixed before. It cost her the fall wedding season. I printed the document on a Tuesday morning and held it in my hands for a long time. Then I put it in a folder and went back to work. My mother's announcement came 3 days later. She chose the kitchen, which was her preferred arena for difficult conversations because she could move around it and use the physical space as punctuation. She made coffee first, which meant she wanted the announcement to feel measured and adult. Then she sat across from me at the table my father had built from reclaimed barnwood the year before I was born, and she told me, with the careful patience of a woman who had been practicing the speech, that she thought it was time for me to find my own place. She said I needed to build independence. She said she had been worried for a while that our arrangement was making it too easy for me to stay comfortable instead of growing. She said she loved me and always would, but that real love sometimes meant pushing someone out of the nest. She said she had been talking to her pastor about it, and he agreed that enabling was a form of harm. Then she said that she had told a few people from the neighborhood that I would be moving out by the end of the month, and that they had offered to come over that Saturday to help celebrate the new chapter. That was when I understood that the departure had already been announced. The party had already been planned. She had not come to have a conversation with me. She had come to deliver a schedule. I asked her one question. I asked whether there was anything she wanted to discuss before Saturday. She said she did not think there was anything complicated about the situation. I said I agreed that it was not complicated. Then I told her I would have everything out by Saturday afternoon, and that I hoped the party was everything she wanted it to be. She blinked at me. Just once, the way people do when they expected a different reaction and have not prepared for the one they received. Then she nodded and went back to her coffee, and that was the whole conversation. I spent the remaining days before Saturday doing the things. The first was moving my belongings out in stages small enough not to be noticed, not because I was hiding anything, but because I did not want a confrontation before I was ready for one. The second was finishing the folder. I added the photo of the banner when I had it. I added a cover page with a clean summary of categories and totals. I added a timeline that started the month I moved back and ended the day before the party. I printed 2 copies. I sealed one in an envelope. The morning after the party, I drove to a diner 20 minutes from the house and called my mother. I told her I needed 30 minutes of her time, that I was not angry, and that I had something I wanted her to see before it became relevant in a context she would like less. She agreed in the tone of a woman who expected to be managing my emotions for the duration of the meeting. She arrived 8 minutes after I did, which told me she had been closer than she let on. She was dressed well, the way she dressed when she expected witnesses to her reasonableness. She ordered coffee and set her hands on the table with the practiced composure of someone prepared to be patient. I placed the folder on the table between us and told her to open it. She opened it with the particular confidence of someone expecting sentiment. That confidence lasted approximately 10 seconds, which was how long it took her eyes to reach the total on the first page. She looked up at me. I held her gaze. She looked back down. I watched her eyes move across the line. Items, software, utilities, supplier advance, studio lease gap, website rebuild, vendor communications, license renewals. I had used the same formatting I used for client reports. Clean and horizontal and impossible to dismiss as emotional. She turned to the second section, the labor estimate, and her jaw tightened in the way it did when she encountered something she wanted to call unfair, but could not immediately find the specific unfairness. She said the numbers seemed high. I asked which ones. She pointed at the labor estimate. I told her it was calculated at 30% below the standard rate for the categories of work involved, and that I had documentation for the hours. She pointed at a supplier payment from 14 months ago. I opened my phone and showed her the bank transfer with the date, the amount, and the vendor name. She pointed at the website rebuild. I had the invoice from the developer saved in the same folder, her name listed as the client, my card as the payment method. She closed the folder and set both hands on top of it. For a long moment she said nothing. The diner moved around us, coffee cups and low conversation and the sound of the kitchen operating normally behind its pass-through window. Then she said I had been keeping score. I told her I had been keeping records. She said there was no difference. I told her there was an important one. Keeping score was about winning. Keeping records was about accuracy. She asked why I was showing her this. I told her that she had spent the last several weeks building a public narrative about our situation, that she had invited neighbors to celebrate my departure, that she had allowed people who did not know the facts to form opinions about my character based on her version of events, and that before that, narrative spread further into places where it might become difficult to correct. I wanted her to understand what the corrected version looked like. She asked if I was threatening her. I told her I was not. I told her the folder was not a demand. I was not asking for repayment. I was not planning to post anything publicly or contact anyone she did business with. I was showing her the document because I needed her to know that it existed, that it was accurate, and that the story she had been telling about me had a different story underneath it that was equally true and considerably more specific. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than it had been, stripped of the composure she had brought with her. She said she had not realized the amounts were that significant. I told her I knew she hadn't. I told her that was the point. She had never had to notice, because I had handled everything quietly. And handling things quietly had allowed her to build a version of events where I was the one being carried. She said that was not how she had seen it. I told her I understood that. I told her that the gap between how she saw it and how it actually was had been exactly large enough for a vinyl banner to fit through. That sentence landed. I could see it in the way she looked away toward the window, the parking lot, the ordinary Saturday morning outside. She rubbed her thumb across the cover of the folder. The way people touch things they are not ready to hold. She asked if I hated her. I told her no. I told her I had loved her consistently and practically for years in ways she had not seen because I had made them invisible, and that the person most harmed by that invisibility had been me. I told her I was not leaving to punish her. I was leaving because the arrangement had always been built on a false accounting, and now that the real accounting existed, staying felt dishonest. She asked what she was supposed to do with the business. I reached into my bag and placed a second envelope beside the folder. Inside was a list. A bookkeeper in Knoxville who charged reasonable rates. A small business attorney who did 1-hour consultations for under $200. A software platform with a free tier that would handle her invoicing and vendor payments with minimal setup. A phone number for the state licensing office she could call to ask questions about renewals. Everything she needed to run the business without me. Resources, I said. That is all I am offering. She looked at the envelope and then back at me. She asked if I really thought she could handle all of it alone. I told her I thought she was capable of learning. I told her my father had believed she was capable of a great deal more than she had allowed herself to attempt. I told her I had believed the same thing for years, and had unfortunately expressed that belief by doing everything for her instead of letting her develop it herself, which meant some of the accountability for the current situation belonged to me too. That surprised her. She had not expected me to claim any portion of it, and the unexpectedness seemed to reach her in a way that the document alone had not. She picked up the folder and held it against her chest and looked at the table for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, that she had not known the banner would feel the way it had apparently felt. I told her I believed her. I told her I thought she had genuinely experienced our arrangement as her carrying me, because I had been careful to make my contributions invisible, and invisible labor is easy to decount. I told her the banner was what happened. When you decount invisible labor long enough, eventually the person doing it stops and the weight becomes visible all at once. She asked if there was any chance I would come back. I told her no, not to live. I told her that did not mean I was gone from her life. It meant I was gone from a version of her life that had required me to be smaller than I was in order to keep working. I told her I hoped she would prove herself right about being capable of independence. Because the version of her that she advertised to the world, the capable businesswoman, the resilient widow, the generous mother, I told her that woman was real. She had just never had to become her fully, because I had always stepped in first. I left the diner before she finished her coffee. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes, not because I was emotional, but because I wanted to feel the fullness of having said every true thing I needed to say, in a room with good lighting and a table between us and no audience to perform for. Then I drove to my new apartment, which was 40 minutes away, in a town called Maryville, where I had signed a lease the previous week. And I unpacked my boxes in the particular quiet of a space that belonged entirely to me. The calls came over the following week in the predictable order. My Aunt Cheryl called first, carefully, asking if I was okay, and managing to imply, without saying it directly, that my mother seemed shaken. I told Aunt Cheryl I was well, and that I hoped she would form her opinions about the situation from both sides when she had the opportunity. She said she would try. I believed her about 40%. My Uncle Hank left a voicemail. That was 5% apology and 95% confusion about why I had not warned anyone that the business finances were in that kind of shape. I did not return it. My cousin Derek texted 3 days after I moved out to ask if my mother had mentioned anything to me about the vendor software going down. The vendor software had gone down because my monthly coordination task that kept the subscription current had not been performed. I texted back that I was no longer managing that account and suggested he contact the software company directly. He replied with a question mark. I sent him the link to the company's support page. He did not respond after that. The business did not collapse. I want to be honest about that because I think clean stories require honest endings. My mother hired a part-time bookkeeper named Terry 6 weeks after I left. I know because Terry contacted me once with a polite question about a vendor file she had found with my email address on it. And I answered her question, and then sent her a brief summary of the account history that I thought would save her several hours of reconstruction. I did that not for my mother and not for the business, but because Terry had done nothing wrong and did not deserve to inherit a mess without a map. The business ran slower for a quarter. One planner reduced her order volume. One venue paused its referral relationship. Those were consequences of the emails my mother sent without me softening them. And my mother eventually recognized the pattern, which led to the hiring of a part-time communications person in addition to Terry. That cost money. That was also fair. My mother called me on a Sunday evening in November, 8 weeks after I moved out. She used my actual name. She did not use the pet name she had been using since I was 7. She said she had been looking at Terry's reports and had realized, fully for the first time, how much had been happening inside the business that she had not known to look for. She said she could not tell yet if the word she was looking for was sorry or thank you, and that the overlap between those two things was uncomfortable. I told her it was probably both. She asked if I would come for Thanksgiving. I said I would think about it. I meant that genuinely, which surprised me when I noticed it. Forgiveness, I was learning, was not one decision. It was a series of smaller decisions made over time when the evidence for change became specific enough to trust. I went to Thanksgiving. I sat at the table my father had built from reclaimed barn wood, and I ate the green bean casserole my mother made the same way every year, with the crispy onions on top that I had loved since I was a child. The banner was gone from between the oak trees. The oak trees were still there, same as always, the same ones my father had planted the year I was born. After dinner, my mother handed me an envelope. Inside was a check, not for the full amount from the folder, for a number that was clearly what she could manage right now, and that was accompanied by a handwritten note on a card that had a watercolor magnolia on the front. The note said, "I am still learning what I did not see. This is the beginning of seeing it." It was the most honest sentence she had ever put in writing to me. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket. My father's recipe box is on my kitchen counter in Maryville. I found it in a storage box I had not opened since the move. His handwriting is on the index cards inside, slanted slightly to the right, the way it always was. One card is labeled Sunday chili and has a note at the bottom in parentheses that says less salt. Sandra prefers it, which made me laugh in a way that felt like him still being present in the room. I framed that card. It hangs above my desk where I can see it when I work. I am not the freeloader in the story my mother told the neighborhood that August. I was the operations system that kept the story from falling apart. I was the invisible bookkeeper, the after-hours vendor manager, the email editor, the license tracker, the quiet reason the business made it to the next season and the next. The only reason my mother could afford to stand in a floral sundress, with a pair of tongs and a vinyl banner between two oak trees, was because the person she was celebrating pushing out had been standing behind her, holding the structure upright for years. She did not know that when she hung the banner. She knows it now, and knowing it has not destroyed her. It has, slowly and imperfectly, made her more honest about what she is capable of building on her own, and what she was allowing herself to avoid. That is not a small thing. It is not a complete thing, but it is a real thing. And real things are the only ones worth counting. My records are still in the folder on my desktop. I have not deleted them, not because I am holding them over her, but because accuracy is its own kind of respect. The numbers are true whether anyone looks at them or not. They were true the whole time. I was making them invisible. They were true when the banner went up between the oak trees. They are true now, in this kitchen in Maryville, with my father's recipe box on the counter and a check in my desk drawer, and a business in Knoxville that is finally learning to carry its own weight. I was never the daughter who needed to be pushed out of the nest. I was the one who had been quietly keeping the nest from falling out of the tree. And the most clarifying thing I ever did for both of us was stop.